In the 2023 presidential election, Bola Ahmed Tinubu won with 8.79 million votes. His three main opponents, Atiku Abubakar, Peter Obi, and Rabiu Kwankwaso, received a combined 14.49 million votes. He lost the popular arithmetic by nearly 6 million ballots, and he still walked into Aso Rock. Now, ask yourself this. What happens when the man who won that way controls the law that governs the next election? Because here is what Mike Igini, a man who built Nigeria's most credible polling unit system from the inside, is now telling anyone who will listen. The 2026 Electoral Act that Tinubu signed on February 18th contains provisions that, in his words, are very dangerous. Provisions that allow a presiding officer to accept a ballot paper that carries no INEC security markings if that officer is personally satisfied the ballot is legitimate. That clause existed in 2010. It was removed precisely because politicians were using it to flood polling units with counterfeit ballots. It has been quietly put back. So hold on to this question until the very end of this video. Who benefits when the law written to catch election fraud is rewritten to protect it? Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. On February 18, 2026, President Tinubu signed the Electoral Act 2026 into law at the State House in Abuja. Senate President Godswill Akpabio and House Speaker Tajuddin Abbas were both present. The administration framed this moment as electoral reform, a milestone for Nigerian democracy. The official narrative was this: technology has been strengthened, BVAS is now statutory, the iRev portal now has legal backing as admissible evidence in election tribunals, and any presiding officer who deliberately frustrates electronic transmission faces 6 months in prison. That is the surface narrative, and parts of it are real. For the first time, iRev data carries statutory legal weight, reversing a Supreme Court ruling that had previously declared it a public viewing portal with no legal force. BVAS accreditation is now mandatory by law, not administrative discretion. These are not small things. But here is the narrative buried underneath all of that, the one almost no one is discussing in full. The same act that makes electronic transmission mandatory creates an escape hatch. Section 63 says, if there is a communication failure, the manual form EC8A becomes the primary source for collation and declaration of results. The Act does not define what communication failure means. Does it mean complete network absence? Intermittent signal? A presiding officer who claims his phone had no bars? That single undefined word is where elections can disappear. And this is not a theoretical concern. In the Edo State governorship election in 2024, PDP won on the electronic iRev collation at the polling unit level. APC was declared the winner based on manual collation at the INEC state headquarters in Benin City. That election happened under the old law. The 2026 Act now enshrines a fallback communication failure that makes what happened in Edo not an anomaly, it makes it a repeatable legal template. Now, why does Mike Igini's voice matter more than any commentator reacting from the outside? Because Igini was not an outside observer. He was one of the architects of the biometric voter register and the card reader system in 2011. He served as the resident electoral commissioner in Akwa Ibom State, a state where under his watch, 2 university professors were prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to prison for electoral fraud. That outcome remains one of the rarest examples of actual electoral accountability in Nigerian electoral history.
When this man says he spotted something very dangerous in the 2026 Act after having stepped back from electoral debates out of sheer frustration with the system, that is not a political statement. That is an institutional alarm from someone who knows exactly where the trapdoor is because he spent years trying to close it. The 2026 Electoral Act has 3 provisions that Igini flagged by section number. Each one operates on a different layer of what he is describing. And when you read them together, the picture they form is not accidental. Start with section 63. It allows a presiding officer to accept a ballot paper without INEC's official manufacturer mark or security features if that officer is personally satisfied the ballot came from an official booklet. The earlier version of this clause was removed from the 2010 Electoral Act for a specific reason. Politicians who had access to INEC security and serial numbers were producing counterfeit ballots and introducing them into the count. Igini was explicit about this in his Arise TV interview. Some INEC officials leaked those security features to politicians during prior election cycles. Reintroducing this clause without any objective criteria for what satisfied means does not just create a loophole, it reinstates a discretion that was already weaponized, that the system already failed to contain, and that electoral reformers had already removed once before. Then there is Section 138.
This provision says that an act or omission which violates INEC's own guidelines and regulations but is not explicitly prohibited by the Electoral Act itself cannot, on its own, be grounds for challenging an election result in tribunal. Think about what that means operationally. INEC's guidelines and regulations are the rulebook for how elections are administered on the ground. They govern how presiding officers handle ballot papers, how results are recorded, how Form EC8A is completed, when and how transmission occurs. If a presiding officer abandons those guidelines, manipulates a result sheet, delays transmission, accepts an unauthorized ballot, but does so in a way that is not word for word prohibited by the Act, that misconduct is now legally shielded from petition. The court cannot hold it against the declared result. As Igini said directly, they are saying that presiding officers, assistant presiding officers, can abandon it, can abandon INEC's own rules, and the evidence of that abandonment is inadmissible as a ground for questioning the outcome. And then, Section 137. This removes the legal requirement to join individual presiding officers or returning officers as direct respondents in election petitions, even when they are the central actors in alleged irregularities. If you allege misconduct by a specific officer, INEC defends the case as an institution on their behalf. The individual, the person who actually altered the result sheet, who accepted the unverified ballot, who delayed the transmission, is insulated from direct accountability in the tribunal. Igini's description of this was precise. You are now saying that the people who rig elections, presiding officers who actually were the makers of the document, because you have joined INEC as a respondent, it shall not be necessary to bring them to the tribunal. The people closest to the fraud are the furthest from legal consequence. These 3 provisions do not exist in isolation. They form a chain. Section 63 allows a fraudulent ballot to enter the count. Section 138 prevents INEC's own guidelines, the rules that would have blocked that ballot, from being used as grounds for legal challenge. Section 137 ensures the officer who made that call cannot be compelled to answer for it directly. From the polling unit, through the collation process, to the tribunal, each link in that chain has now been legally protected. Now, let us follow the money, because the legal architecture is only half the story. INEC has been allocated 1.013 trillion naira in the 2026 national budget, one of the largest allocations in the Commission's history. On its own, that figure is defensible. Nigeria has 93 million registered voters, over 176,000 polling units, and elections that are among the most logistically complex operations on the continent. But look at what sits alongside it in the same budget. 17 billion naira has been approved under a community-based national action program to be distributed at the ward level. No public breakdown of implementing partners, no transparent selection criteria, just 17 billion naira flowing to the ward level in an election cycle. Opposition parties have already called for a full audit of who receives those funds and on what basis. In a country where constituency projects have historically served as political patronage mechanisms, the timing alone demands scrutiny.
And then there's this. Buried under service-wide votes in the 2026 budget, a central pool of federal funds not tied to any specific ministry is a 135.22 billion naira allocation labeled Electoral Adjudication and Post-Election Provision. This is a legal war chest. It is entirely separate from the 1 trillion naira statutory transfer to INEC. It is the federal government's own fund to fight election petitions, already budgeted, already set aside, before a single vote has been cast in 2027. Put the three figures side by side: 1 trillion naira to run the election, 17 billion naira at the ward level with no accountability structure, and a 135 billion naira to win the lawsuits that follow. The financial architecture of 2027 was built before the opposition had agreed on a party. Now, who is the silent stakeholder at the center of all of this? The opposition's Ibadan Declaration, signed in late April 2026 by major opposition figures including Atiku, Obi, Kwankwaso, Amechi, Mark, and Arigbesola, and hosted by Governor Seyi Makinde, contained a formal vote of no confidence in INEC's chairman, Professor Joash Amopitan. They called for his removal. They described his continued tenure as capable of triggering a national crisis. Professor Amopitan was nominated by President Tinubu on October 9, 2025. He was confirmed by an APC-controlled Senate on October 16. He was sworn in on October 23. Social media screenshots emerged after his appointment, allegedly linking him to posts expressing support for Tinubu after the 2023 election declaration. Amopitan has denied these, insisting the claims were fabricated to damage his reputation. But the political damage was done, and the institutional question it raises is real. The man who interprets INEC's operational guidelines, the same guidelines that Section 138 now says cannot by themselves be grounds for petition, was appointed by the president whose party benefits when those guidelines are not enforced. That is the institutional circuit this entire story runs through, and we will come back to exactly what that means before we are done. Now, look at what is happening to the opposition in real time, because this is where the strategic picture crystallizes. In the 2023 election, Tinubu won 8.79 million votes. His three opponents combined for 14.49 million. The mathematics of a united opposition defeating him in 2027 exists on paper. The opposition knows this. The ADC, the African Democratic Congress, was supposed to be the vehicle. Atiku, Obi, Kwankwaso, Amechi, El-Rufai, Arigbesola, Mark, a coalition of names that spans the PDP diaspora, the Labour Party base, and the Kwankwasia machine. But as of today, May 3, 2026, that coalition is fracturing in public. Peter Obi and Rabio Kwankwaso are now reportedly preparing to leave the ADC entirely and move to the NDC, the National Democratic Congress. A formal announcement is expected as early as tomorrow. The Kwankwasia movement's chairman has already confirmed the decision. What remains in ADC if they leave is primarily the establishment northern PDP bloc around Atiku, a different kind of coalition and a far weaker one for a national election. INEC's deadline for submission of party membership registers is May 10th, 7 days from now. The opposition has 7 days to stabilize a platform it has spent months building or risk entering 2027 fragmented across 3 or 4 vehicles, none of which has the national organizational spine to mount a credible single challenge to a sitting president with a 1 trillion naira electoral budget and a 135 billion naira legal reserve already in place.
Governor Seyi Makinde, who hosted the Ibadan summit, has not formally defected from PDP to ADC. He is watching. His silence is its own signal. If the Obi-Kwankwaso bloc exits, Makinde has no strategic reason to leave a state-level stronghold for a national platform that may not survive its own registration deadline. And there is something else the APC is quietly betting on. They are not reacting to opposition moves. They are executing a plan that predates the opposition's current crisis. The financial architecture, the ward money, the legal reserve, the INEC budget was in place before the Ibadan summit happened, before the ADC fracture became public. The administration is not fighting the opposition. It is watching the opposition fight itself. Now, I want to be fair and I want to be precise, because this analysis is not about picking sides. It is about understanding power. The government's defenders make a substantive argument. They say the 2026 Electoral Act is, on balance, a genuine improvement over 2022, and they are not entirely wrong. IREV data now has statutory weight as admissible evidence in election petitions. BVAS accreditation is mandatory by law, not administrative discretion. A presiding officer who deliberately frustrates electronic transmission faces criminal liability. INEC now has a dedicated fund with a statutory disbursement timeline, reducing the political leverage that historically came from controlling INEC's budget release. These are real changes. They also argue, and this argument deserves to be taken seriously, that the opposition's calls for Amupitan's removal echo the exact same script the PDP ran against Atahiru Jega in 2015. Jega was a credible INEC chairman. His elections were ultimately accepted, but PDP walked out of the results announcement, seized the microphone, and attacked him publicly, laying the groundwork for post-election legal arguments. The pattern of attacking INEC chairs before elections to pre-poison the well of legitimacy is real. It happened, and the APC is correct that the ADC is doing it earlier than most.
But here is where the government's defense fails. The problem with the 2026 Act is not what it says on its face. It is what it leaves undefined. The communication failure proviso in Section 63 is not a minor technical gap. It is the architectural escape valve for the entire electronic transmission regime. And legal analysts who have examined the Act, not opposition politicians, legal analysts, have concluded that the Act nowhere defines what communication failure means. It is silent on whether it covers complete network absence, intermittent connectivity, equipment malfunction, human error, or deliberate interference. The proviso has no documentation obligation, no timeline obligation, no independent verification mechanism. Which means the question is not whether electronic transmission is mandated. The question is who decides when communication failure has occurred? The presiding officer. The same officer whose individual accountability Section 137 has removed from direct tribunal scrutiny. The same officer whose violation of INEC guidelines Section 138 has shielded from serving as petition grounds. These three provisions do not contradict each other, they reinforce each other. And that is what Igini understood the moment he read them. There's also a misconception that deserves to be corrected, not condescendingly, but clearly. Many Nigerians believe that BVAS, the biometric accreditation machine, is the safeguard that makes rigging impossible. That belief is not accurate. BVAS confirms that the voter who shows up is the registered voter. It does not govern what happens to the result after accreditation. The FIEC 8A, the physical results sheet, is what determines who wins at the polling unit. And the results that travel from polling unit to ward, to local government, to state headquarters, to Abuja are only as secure as the legal framework protecting that journey. Section 63, 137, and 138 are about that journey. And under the 2026 Act, that journey has 3 legally sanctioned vulnerabilities: at the point of accreditation, at the point of challenge, and at the point of accountability. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let me tell you what the next moves look like and what signals Nigerians need to be watching for. The first move is the opposition split completing itself. If Obi and Kwankwaso formally announce their NDC platform tomorrow, the ADC-NDC divide becomes permanent ahead of INEC's May 10th deadline. A Tinubu machine running against a divided opposition field of 3 or 4 platforms is not a competitive election, it is arithmetic. The combined 14.49 million votes that opposed Tinubu in 2023 only matter if they are cast for one candidate. Fragmented, they guarantee a Tinubu plurality even on reduced turnout. The second move is the legal challenge to the act itself. Civil society organizations and opposition legal teams are already building arguments around the constitutionality of Section 63, 137, and 138. Igini's public speech at the Ibadan summit was not just advocacy, it was the building of a public record. The critical question is whether those legal challenges reach the Supreme Court before the election and produce amendments, or only after, when challenging a declared result carries a much heavier evidentiary burden. The third move is the administration's continued financial positioning. Nothing about the 17 billion naira ward fund, the 135 billion naira legal reserve, and the 1 trillion naira INEC budget changes based on what the opposition does. Those funds are already committed. The plan is already in motion. That is the single clearest signal about how seriously this administration is treating 2027. Here is what to watch specifically in the coming weeks. Watch the May 10th INEC deadline, which parties file valid membership registers and which are challenged or disqualified. Watch whether the Attorney General's attempt to deregister the ADC proceeds through the courts, because that alone could knock the largest opposition platform off the ballot entirely. And watch the Ekiti and Osun governorship elections, the first full test of the 2026 Electoral Act in a contested political environment. If the communication failure escape clause in Section 60.3 is invoked in either of those states, not who invokes it, in which local government, and what the final declared result looks like against the IREF figures, that will be the preview of 2027. Now let me return to the question I asked at the very beginning of this video. Who benefits when the law written to catch election fraud is rewritten to protect it? The full answer that this analysis builds towards is not a single name, it is a system. A chairman of INEC nominated by the incumbent in October 2025, confirmed by his party's Senate, and now accused by the full weight of the organized opposition of being unfit to conduct a free election. A BVAS hack Electoral Act signed by that same incumbent in February 2026, containing 3 interlocking provisions, Section 63, 137, and 138, that in combination allow unverified ballots into the count, shield the officers who accept them from direct accountability in tribunals, and prevent courts from acting on violations of INEC's own operational guidelines. A 135 billion naira legal war chest already budgeted and waiting for the petitions that will follow. And an opposition that as of May 3, 2026, cannot agree on a platform 7 days before a critical registration deadline that will determine who is even on the ballot. Mike Igini did not arrive at his conclusions after the fact. He pleaded with Tinubu before he signed the act. His exact words were, on national television, "Be a man of history. What is put before you, take it back. Don't sign it." Tinubu signed it. That is not a prediction about 2027. That is a description of a system that a man who built Nigeria's most credible electoral safeguards looked at directly, named by section number, and publicly warned would be used to undo everything those safeguards were meant to protect.
Where does Nigeria end up in 5 years if this trajectory holds? A disputed 2027 result litigated for 18 months, a governance legitimacy crisis that compounds a security environment already strained by insurgency and banditism in the northwest and northeast, an opposition fragmented across multiple platforms without national organizational spine, and a legal architecture, now statute, that makes mounting a successful post-election challenge structurally harder than any previous election cycle. That is not speculation. That is the direction the architecture points. And architecture in politics is destiny, unless the people who are supposed to change it decide that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of action. So here is the question I'll leave for the comments. 93 million registered voters, a president who won with 8.78 million of them, a new electoral law with 3 legally defined escape routes for fraud, an opposition that cannot agree on a platform 7 days before a critical registration deadline, and a 135 billion naira legal fund already sitting in the budget, waiting for the lawsuits. Is what Igini described a warning or a description of something already decided? If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.